Hello and welcome to this masterclass webinar on the role of the non-executive director. This webinar is part of our Atlas Leadership Series, which is a collection of free educational webinars open to all and specifically created to help improve the effectiveness of boards of directors and their leaders. My name is Martin Chapman and I'm joined today by Seamus Gillen, who will deliver what I know will be a thoroughly interesting and thought-provoking masterclass. Before introductions and getting started, we'll hold for a couple of minutes or so just to allow people to get connected into the webinar and settle in. And then we'll get started with Seamus. Thank you very much.
Right.
How are you today?
Thanks, Martin. Good to see you. Good to be on this again. Maybe we could ask participants who are joining just to let us know in the chat box where everyone's joining from. That would be interesting to know, whether we're all UK or from further afield. That'd be good to know.
Absolutely. And just while people are joining in here, I'll repeat these instructions, but hey, Helen, welcome. There are two functions where you can engage with us and with each other. The Q&A allows you to send questions into us, which are just visible to the panel here. And the chat allows you to chat with everybody who's on the webinar. So please feel free to submit your questions through the Q&A and also any comments and chat that everyone can see through the chat function. And those are the bottoms that should be in your across the bottom of your Zoom screen. Cornwall, lovely.
Yeah, I see Jacqueline is joining us from the BBC studio, so maybe we're on TV today. I don't know. That'd be cool. And yeah, great.
Well, it's a very, very grey day in London today. It's pretty dark. Still getting used to it being dark at 7 o'clock in the morning.
Yeah, that's dreadful. Yeah, I was in Cardiff and the weather yesterday was gorgeous yesterday and dreadful. Storm, what's it called? Storm Debbie? Was it Storm Debbie on what, Tuesday? Oh, dreadful. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, we are a couple of minutes in, so let's get going. Hello everyone and welcome again to this masterclass webinar on the role of the non-executive director, NED. This webinar is part of our Atlas Leadership Series, which is a collection of free educational webinars open to all and specifically created to help improve the effectiveness of boards of directors and their leaders. My name is Martin Chapman. I'm the Chief Product Officer at Onboard, and we're hosting today's webinar. I'm joined by Seamus Gillen, who will deliver what I know will be a really interesting and thought-provoking masterclass as well. So this is our third, I think, Seamus, right, in this series?
That's right. Yeah.
And the final as well. So I'm just going to go through some housekeeping matters first. So firstly, all guests are muted and your cameras are disabled. So there's no sort of chance of you accidentally turning on microphones or cameras, etc. You can send questions to us via the Q&A chat feature. So if you've got questions for us, you can put those through there and you can choose whether to be anonymous or not. But if you'd like to chat openly amongst the group, then you can use the chat feature. And those are the standard sort of features that you get in Zoom. This is being conducted under Chatham House rules. And in addition to that, we've got some polls. And the responses of those polls will also be anonymous. So each of those individual polls we can set, and we set those to be anonymous. So Chatham House and responses to polls, of which we have quite a few, are anonymous. At the very end of the survey, please do rate the webinar. There'll be a 30-second quick survey at the end for you to do so. And as I mentioned earlier, this webinar is going to be followed by a masterclass, which is a deep dive into this topic by Seamus. Seamus, that's about 90 minutes, is that right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Deep dive.
Yeah.
Excellent. Okay.
Yeah.
Just a little bit about us. If you've not heard of Onboard before, prior to today, this is who we are. So we're a board meeting management and governance software company. And our goal is really to inspire and enable board-led organizations to do their best work, their best board work in a digital world. So we provide capabilities and tools and insights, etc., into how your board is working in member engagement and various other types of things. We serve about 5,000 organizations. That's 12,000 committees, 55,000 meetings a year. And there's 100,000 plus board members who use the platform all across the world. Thank you, Seamus. Why don't I start by introducing introducing Seamus. Seamus is an author, governance advisor, director, and trainer who has been running Value Alpha for over 17 years. He's as many of you, if you know, Seamus is incredibly passionate about governance as a business enabler and an essential sort of underpin for effective value creation. Seamus works with boards, directors, board secretaries the world over, focusing on board and director effectiveness. He's particularly proud of his work writing the UK's Financial Reporting Council's guidance on board effectiveness, which is, in many people's view, was one of the most refreshing and sort of straightforward pieces of code guidance globally on building better boards. Seamus, welcome, and it's great to have you with us today.
Right, thank you very much. And that's where you can get hold of me, and but otherwise just find me on LinkedIn. And Martin, thank you very much for mentioning that as an author. So this book was published last year by Bloomsbury Business, and obviously very proud of the book itself. So, and a lot of what we'll be discussing today can be found in the book as well. So yeah.
Okay, well, we're going to get started, and we're going to start with a number of polls. And this is really just to frame the conversation that we're going to be having. And if the poll will come up on your screen, it's in Zoom. So as I mentioned, the responses are anonymous, and it'd be great to get your feedback on these so that we can get some discussion going. Please feel free, if you like, to sort of put your own comments into the chat if you'd like to share those with people. So the first question, poll number 1, do you have any non-executive directors on your board? So any NEDs on your board?
Yeah, and also, I suppose, Martin, we're also asking if you're not on a board or near to a board, the board with which you are most familiar, about which you can speak most knowledgeably. Are there NEDs on that board?
Okay, here we go. Okay, so yes, 88%, no, 12%.
Yeah, and it would be interesting to know why on a particular board, some people have said they don't have any NEDs, because if we're talking about a board, as we understand the term board, which is the single form of governance in the world over, we have a board-led model of governance across the whole of the world, then what kind of boards would those be that don't actually have any NEDs on them? Are they internal boards, which is quite possible in financial services? There's a lot of internal boards which are populated simply by executive directors, even though they may be limited companies and registered at Companies House and so on. They will still only have internal board directors on them. So that would be interesting to know what underpins that, the answer to that one.
Okay. Our next poll is question number 2 is, if you have NEDs on your board, are they independent or non-independent?
And whilst people are voting on this, Martin, I get this question a lot around the world. I mean, we're kind of used to the idea that NEDs are independent. And so in the English language, we use the acronym INEDs, independent non-executive directors. That's such a fundamental part of the concept that a non-executive director will be independent. And there are criteria for determining independence when sitting on a board. But it's not unusual around the world, and maybe here in the UK, so it'd be interesting to see people's comments on whether they have on their boards non-executive directors who are not technically independent, maybe because they've served for more than 9 years, or they've gone with the organisation in the recent past. So I'll let you read out those.
Yeah. So everybody, 100%. This is a multiple choice question. 100% of people have independent directors, and 15 or so not independent.
Yeah,
Dax in the chat here had put that they have both a mix of INEDs and NEDs.
yeah. So if anybody who's put non-independent, if you could identify why you consider those NEDs not to be independent, and in the UK Corporate Governance Code, which is just one code amongst many around the world, we do have issues like the non-executive director should not have had a material business relationship over the past 5 years, or should not have had a material contractual working relationship over the previous 3 years with the organisation. So it'd be interesting to know why people have actually identified some of their NEDs as not independent. So please feel free to put that in the chat box.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Poll 3, which description best matches the board with which you work? So this is a unitary board, which is sort of the main type of board, I suppose, the most common that we sort of come across. Unitary, so a non-exec majority plus exec directors, which is, would you say that? Well, we'll find out in a moment, I guess, Seamus, whether that's the most common.
Yeah, I think that's the dominant model, but it'll be interesting to see. Yeah.
Yeah.
And Amanda, you've asked a question which we'll come to in a moment about how AI technologies are being used to maximize board effectiveness. And that is a very interesting question, which we can catch up on in a second. The relationship between AI and boards. So Martin, I'll let you read those out.
Absolutely. So the unitary to the NED majority plus exec directors was 48%. So that's the most, as you say, the most dominant one, Seamus, as you expected. Followed by the one after that was a unitary, a balanced actually. So a balanced unitary board, non-exec and executive directors at 22%. The non-exec minority was the next highest at 15%. NED only was at 7%. That's the fourth. These start getting very low now. Executive only 4% and other 4%. It'd be great to hear in the chat for the people who put other what those others are. Thank you very much, Seamus.
So those are some interesting results. Again, we would expect the dominant model, certainly in the UK, is majority of non board, and in fact that's what the code are, that there are variations on that, including NEDs as a minority. That's interesting. 50-50 NEDs and exec directors, that's being flagged up as the board, as some of the participants on this webinar have in their working lives and their working experience. So yeah, that's an interesting range. I mean, it has to be said that, for example, NED only boards, that's a model which tends to be found in Scandinavia. It's a model which can also be found supervisory boards in Germany and the Netherlands, management boards, which is where management is to be found. So, for example, in the German model or the Dutch model, management does not sit on the main oversight board. So again, that's interesting to see that on the call. We've got some people who are NED only, executive only. Interesting. That could well be one of these internal financial services boards where the people working in the outside office then go into a meeting room and become the directors of the board, which is then meeting in that meeting room. So there's a good choice there. Maybe we could just very quickly have a look at the Q&A. So
yeah, there's a question that's come through, Seamus, that I just probably should mention that you were breaking up a little bit there. So you're fine at the moment, but I think some people had observed that. I'd noticed that too, but you seem fine at the moment. There's a question.
I'll stop the video. I'll stop my video. I'll come off video.
There's a question about what would you describe employee members of the board as?
Well, yeah, so employee members of the board are not independent. They will not be executive, so they're non-executive members of the board, because they are not responsible. They're not part of the senior management team for running the organization. They're clearly not independent. So that is a very good example of a non-independent, non-executive director. And under the provisions, certainly in the UK, of encouraging worker representation on boards, which is a common part of the model elsewhere in the world, as we mentioned, Germany and the Netherlands, then if that is happening in the UK, that employees are joining boards, then they will be non-executive directors, but they will also not be independent. So that's to answer. And Michelle, you're asking, can you please explain the difference between independent and non-independent? So the point is, do people sit on a board who they're not part of the major management team, the senior management team, the leadership team, but they so they're not running the business, but they do have some kind of close contractual relationship with the business, either as a provider of goods and services, or as an employee, or their partner is very closely associated with board decision making. Or, for example, under the UK Corporate Governance Code, they've been on the board for more than 9 years and are therefore no longer considered independent of mind. Those would be examples of non-independent, non-executive directors. Okay, so some other questions to come up, but let's crack on with the next poll. Over to you, Martin.
Thanks. Provide an overall average rating of NED performance on your board. And as I mentioned, these are Chatham House, but also these are anonymous. The responses aren't tracked against any names that you entered when you joined, so these are anonymous. Yeah, provide an overall average rating of NED performance on your board, from excellent to awful. Seamus, if you want to, you can try coming back on and seeing if, and I can let you know whether there's a problem again. At which point,
let me know straight away, please. Yeah, and
okay.
Otherwise, I'm sure people can forego seeing me. So, Martin, did you want to?
Yeah, excellent. The results have come through, and so it's good to know that there are 0% in the awful category. Excellent, 22%. Good, 52%, okay, 17%, and poor, 9%.
Yeah, my reflections on that, Martin, is actually, I know this is utopian, but I would expect all board members to be excellent. That is, you know, we look for the gold standard on boards, and boards are the controlling mind of the organisation. Everything begins and ends with the board. If something goes wrong, it's normally at the board level that the problems begin. So we need directors to be at the top of their game. And the fact that excellent only constitutes 22% of the poll findings, slightly worrying for me. Some people may wish to challenge me on that. Okay, good. Our directors are good. 52%, half of the poll respondents saying their directors are good. Well, that's great. You know, that's not bad. But and so between good and excellent, we've got 74%, 3/4 of the poll findings. But I think all of our work as governance professionals should be seeking to get directors to be in the excellent category. I've worked with boards where they have all been pretty much excellent. And I have to say, I've worked with boards where maybe a majority of the board members have been poor. And those are boards in difficulty and directors who don't really know what they're doing. and that's all a little bit problematic. So quite a range there, but we are looking at all NEDs in particular being high performing, and the poll results suggest that that's not totally the case. Just before we go back on to the next poll, I know my voice broke up, and Edward asked me to repeat the point I was making about European board composition. And the point I was making is that, for example, in Germany, which is Europe's most powerful economy, they have a supervisory board structure where all the members of the supervisory board are non-executive directors, and members of management cannot be on the supervisory board. The same model will be found in the Netherlands, that kind of two-tier board. So it's quite different from what the culture in the UK, for example. In Germany and the Netherlands, you will have worker representatives on the supervisory board, which is not really the kind of model that we're used to in the UK. And then in Scandinavia, boards again tend to be NED only, non-executive director only, because in Scandinavia they consider the Anglo-Saxon board, the one that we have in the UK, as being captured by management. And I think there is a very strong intellectual argument in support of that idea, that incumbent management on the board can capture a board and have undue influence on a board. So there are different variations, in different jurisdictions, and that's why we tend not to talk about best practice for governance, because it depends on the jurisdiction within which the board is to be found as to culturally what would be expected to be good practice, and for that particular jurisdiction, best practice.
James, if you wouldn't mind dropping off video, that'd be great. I'll do the same. There was a question that came through from Michelle, which was, can you define board directors being excellent? So perhaps some of the practices, some of the characteristics, behaviors.
Yeah, so excellent board directors would be people who know exactly what the right discussion should be had inside the boardroom, and will ensure that the agenda is actually focused on the value narrative of the business rather than going off track. An excellent board director will be having a very careful attention to detail in relation to the composition of the board, and whether the people sitting around the board table are the right people to be having those discussions. Their behaviours will be exemplary, and they will not be destructive. They will be behaviours that allow the conversation to take place inside the boardroom and good decision making to be had. And they will also own board process in terms of the quality of the board pack, the circulation of MI. These are some of the issues that we'll look at in the masterclass about what does an excellent NED actually look like. And in completely the opposite direction, poor NEDs are people who don't take those things seriously and don't show what I call boardcraft, the ability to work on a board in a way that actually adds value to the decision-making capability of the board. Hopefully that's better in terms of the audio, and I apologise if the audio has been poor. So here on to the next question, Martin. The next
poll. Fifth poll, and we've got one more after this one, I think. How many of your non-executive directors do you consider are sort of relatively non-performing? Let's open that up.
So whilst people
this is obviously Chatham House, and again mention it's anonymous as well.
Yeah. So David was asking, are employee members actually directors or staff representatives? And I think, David, that depends on the board in question. It could be that they are just simply staff representatives, even trade union representatives. In university councils, for example, we have faculty represented on university council, and they are staff representatives. We have student body representatives on university councils. but they could actually be senior as well as directors. But if they're directors, they are likely to be helping to run the business, and they would be on the board in another capacity. Okay, Martin, over to you.
Hey, yeah. So just a reminder of that question: how many of your non-execs do you consider relatively non-performing? 63% non, 17% one, and an equal number, 17% were two, and a small number of small percentage was more than three. So 4% was more than three of the non-execs were considered relatively non-performing. With your earlier comment about sort of that you'd expect everyone to be excellent, how does this land with you, Seamus?
So I'm always concerned to hear that there are non-performing directors on a board, because the effectiveness of a board is the effectiveness of the weakest director. So if there's anybody on the board who is non-performing, then they're slowing down the rest of the board, and they are actually creating liabilities for the other board members. And where the board is formally constituted, whether as a charity commission board, some form of trust, a limited company, or even a public limited company under the Companies Act, there are real liabilities involved in having directors on the board who are not performing. My advice generally is that those board members should be removed and got off the board as quickly as possible, because they are creating real liabilities for everybody else who is actually on the board. So slightly alarming that there are some results back suggesting 1, 2, or even more than 3 directors on the board are non-performing. That is an immediate sign of board dysfunction, and that board is going to struggle to be effective. And then launching the final poll, Martin.
Yeah, absolutely. And if anybody wants to share, if anybody who had one or more relatively non-performing members wants to share any examples with us, please put them into the Q&A. That will be anonymous in there if you select anonymous. So please feel free, and we can read those out as well. Okay, this is the last one. It's a little bit on the complex side, but hopefully it might prove to be interesting. We probably won't spend too much time on the responses, but it might be. We just want to provide those back to you. And then we'll get into the actual into the masterclass aspect of it. Okay, so in what areas would you judge your non-executive directors add the most value? There's a multiple choice list here, so you can select more than one of these items, which is different to the prior polls. In what areas would you judge your NEDs to add the most value?
And whilst people are replying to that, just looking at some of the chat in the chat box about whether being a great director is a utopian aspiration or whatever. I think it's a realistic aspiration that all board directors should be highly performing. Another comment about whether people who aren't used to being on the board can hold the rest of the board back. Well, absolutely. And that's where induction is important at the beginning of an NED's career on the board, and also where coaching and mentoring are on a constant basis throughout the tenure of the NED being on that board is absolutely critical. It's not a sign of weakness, it's a sign of potential strength to help people be good on a board and to get better all the time, so they can then move on to another board.
There was an interesting comment there also about the executives, the quality there, getting the right level of quality for the board to be the most effective, getting the right level of quality for the executive input. Do you see? How do you see that improving, Seamus? Is that about coaching? Is that more exposure to the board? Is it about the board being more direct in their feedback about what they want to see?
Yeah, my experience is that executive serving on the board is it's a skill area, and some executives have not had the necessary skill and knowledge development and lived experience and training to help them understand how to work on a board. And it's interesting when they serve on a board where the NEDs are experienced, it quickly becomes apparent to the NEDs that they need an upgrade in the performance of the executive directors on the board. And we see this in particular when executives go and serve on another board, that they will sometimes seek to influence. Well, influence is what they don't do. They use hard power rather than soft power, because they're used to using hard power back in the workplace, whereas all boards operate on the basis of soft power. So executives sometimes need to learn that it's about soft power. It's about changing people's minds rather than telling people what to think. So this is an interesting set of results.
Yeah.
Wanted to read.
And everyone can see these. They are shared on with everybody. The top three, I suppose, I say the top three, they've been the largest areas of responses. Strategy, 80%, risk to strategy, 75%. And then I think the next one is oversight of management performance being the third sort of top response. What stands out for you in this, Seamus?
So, some key things that are coming out of this is that in the area of ethics, values, and behaviours, that is only receiving a score of 40%, in contrast with strategy and risk and oversight of performance. That worries me because the tone is set at board level, and just for a director to take an interest in strategy and risk does not exclude her or him from also taking a view on and being a leader on ethics, values, and behaviours. I'm also slightly concerned that stakeholder relations, being good on stakeholder relations, is only coming in at 25%. Again, in contrast to strategy at 80% or risk at 75%. Understanding stakeholders' needs is a fundamental part of being able to perform and to have an effective board and effective board performance. And I'm very surprised, legal and compliance, 15%. Again, there's no prizes for being illegal and non-compliant. So actually, the trick in this question is that I would be expecting high performance across all of these areas. But it's only in certain areas, strategy, risk, and oversight management performance, that the NEDs are performing particularly strongly. And in other areas such as ethics and values, stakeholder relations, and again, oversight of the management talent pipeline, those scores are all low. And that would bother me about a board, that those scores are that low, because as I say, all NEDs should be capable of scoring well in all of these areas if the board is to be performing properly. So a little bit of a trick question, maybe, in a way. But yeah, so before we go on to talk about the role of the NED, maybe we can just have a look at some of the stuff which is coming up in the Q&A. So we still have to come back to the point about AI technologies. So, Bill, you say the word stakeholder, is that a bit imprecise? It should be critical business partner. That's a term I prefer to stakeholder. But stakeholders are the people we rely on to run the business. They're the staff, they're the customers, they're the providers of capital and finance into the organisation. These are all the people whose views we need to take account of in order to run the board well and to run the business well and the organisation well. Every organisation has stakeholders, and it's one of my experiences that our boards do not take sufficient account of wider stakeholder expectation in formulating strategy. And one comment Q&A from an anonymous is, in an organisation that's based on the promotion of quality, the board concentrates on checking everything. We have over 150 KPIs, for example. The issue is expanded, that we're no longer able to do anything other than measure the quality the board believes is performing excellently. I suppose a comment I'd have is anything which is 150 as key performance indicators is, for me, a little bit of a contradiction in terms. Key performance indicators might be 5 to 10 drivers of performance rather than 150. But that's maybe a conversation we can have in a second. Okay, so Martin, I'll look at you to please to keep an eye on comments being made.
Absolutely.
So we've got half an hour, just under half an hour, to talk about the role of the non-executive director, and those polls were mainly aimed at just trying to work out: do you have NEDs on your board? Are they performing? How many of them are non-performing? Where do they add value most, and so on? And this is something I'd like to discuss in a bit more detail in masterclass. But I'm going to show you some slides now on what an NED is actually supposed to be doing on a board. Before I show you, and I've got 7 slides to show on that. Before I show the first slide through to 7, I just wanted to provide some historical context. Where does a non-executive director actually come from? And Bob Tricker, who is one of the great governance gurus in the evolution of thinking on governance, pointed out that the 19th century was a century of entrepreneurialism in organizations and business world. So entrepreneurialism. The 20th century was the century of management, and the 21st century was a century of governance. So in the 20th century, we had a very strong body of thinking coming out, particularly from the US after the Second World War, which was focused on how to be a good manager, how to be a good executive. We had Taylor, we had a whole load of academics who tried to create the whole concept of it all being about management. And in 1984, Bob Tricker introduced devised the term corporate governance. And it was Bob Tricker who charted the fact that increasingly organizations realized that they could not and should not rely simply on management to run their organizations. But the thinking throughout most of the 20th century and into the tail end of the 20th century was that the best people to run an organization were the people who effectively owned it, and that was management. And we didn't want anybody else involved because nobody understood our business better than management. But eventually, there began to be a movement of bringing in people who were not management onto a board in order to bring in skills, knowledge, experience, diversity of thinking, and so on. And this was really only happening towards the end of the 20th century. And we shouldn't think that non-executive directors have existed for hundreds of years. They haven't. The focus was on management running the business. But slowly and surely, non-executive directors, NEDs, were brought in to help the management run their business better. And it was in the first code in the world, the Cadbury Code in 1992, that Adrian Cadbury acknowledged the work of Bob Tricker, not least for the invention of the term corporate governance. And we have to remember that the 1992 Cadbury Code, which was the first version of the UK Corporate Governance Code, which has now been in place for over 30 years, was an attempt to give non-executive directors guidance and influence and power to counter the impact of management on boards. That is what the 92 Code was about. And the evolution of code in the UK has been based on giving non-executive directors, as they began to emerge as a concept, as I say, the power and the influence to counter the impact and the power and the influence of the management. And so we finally, and we'll look at this in the masterclass, we finally evolved into a situation with the UK Corporate Governance Code, whereby we said eventually in the UK, we want non-executives actually to be in the majority. So over the 30 years of code guidance from 1992, we're now 2023, the NED emerged. And because it was the first code in the world and created this concept of the non-executive director and attempted to give them power and influence, the codes around the rest of the world followed suit. So I wouldn't want us to think that non-executive directors have been around for an age. They have not. They've only really been around for 30 or 40 years. And it was to counter the impact and the influence of management on boards. And we now have an established model where NEDs are expected, certainly in the UK, to be in the majority, and in other jurisdictions, as we've discussed, Scandinavia, Germany, the Netherlands, and so on, where actually the non-executive directors are 100% of the top level board composition. Okay, so that's a little bit of historical background. So we've now reached the point where we say we know what we want a non-executive director to do. And so this is the role of the non-executive director. I've got 7 slides to show you. This is what the NED should be doing. And the very first point is the most important thing an NED should be doing is introducing constructive challenge into the boardroom. And this is an issue which is very big in the US, where NEDs do not consider it their job to challenge the CEO and the incumbent management team, but to support the CEO. So some of our biggest crises come out of the US, such as Boeing 737 MAX, Theranos, the blood testing technology, Sam Fried-Bank and FTX, sorry, Bankman-Fried and FTX. These have all been examples where either the board hasn't existed or the board has existed, but they see their job there as being to support the CEO and not to challenge the CEO. And this is one of the big cultural differences between the US and governments in the rest of the world. So we expect NEDs to take on the principal responsibility of constructive critical challenge inside the boardroom. And it's a job of the chair to make sure that that happens. So we have the 6 C's. It's the job of the chair to create the climate of constructive critical challenge. And for many of us, that is such a fundamental aspect of boards in our lived experience that we would think it difficult to imagine a board where that wasn't the case. But the fact is, even now, we still find boards, even in the UK and in Ireland and in parts of Western Europe and so on, where we do not have sufficient constructive challenge to the management team or what the management team is bringing to the board for decision and for developing strategy. But what else should the non-executive director be doing? Scrutinizing the performance of management in meeting those agreed goals and objectives and monitoring the reporting of performance. Again, lots of boards do not have adequate suites of KPIs. They do not have adequate dashboards or other forms of management feedback mechanisms that will allow the board to work out whether the management is being effective and whether the board is doing its job. And one of the points I'd want to make before I forget here, Martin, is that it's the job of the board to deliver assurance and not to receive reassurance. So what happens with some boards, and in my case, many boards, is that management comes along and offers reassurance to the NEDs that everything is okay. And it's the job of the non-executive to say, I don't want to receive your reassurance, I want evidence, prove it. And that is called assurance. So the job of the NED in scrutinizing the performance of management is to demand evidence, and that is called assurance. And when management comes along and says, you don't need to worry about that, everything's okay, that's called reassurance, and that is not acceptable inside a boardroom. And every time management tries to reassure the board, that is a red flag. And it's the job of the chair and the job of the non-executives to say, that's not good enough, give us the evidence.
James, that's a really interesting distinction. I'm curious as to maybe people can put some of their comments in on what they're seeing in their own boardrooms. on that point. So, thanks, James.
Yeah, thanks, Martin. So yeah, if people could just put on in the chat box a single word, what most typifies their board? Is it reassurance or assurance? That would be very interesting to see the results on that. So what else are the non-execs there to do? Of course, to satisfy themselves on the integrity of financial information and the financial controls and systems of risk management are in place, and the importance of having independent control functions, compliance, risk management, audit, and so on. Independent functions reporting into the board to tell board members how it really is going on inside the organization, determining the appropriate levels of remuneration of executive directors, and being involved in their appointment and their removal. And I mentioned earlier the fact that there was a fairly low score in terms of do your NEDs add a lot of value to on the issue of talent pipeline. That is a principal responsibility of the board. Talent pipeline, the talent pipeline from management and who's coming on next into the top team is actually a critical responsibility of the board. And I would argue that the board is in breach of its fiduciary duty if it isn't taking an adequate amount of interest in the management pipeline and the talent pipeline. So that's one
just,
set of...
Miss, you wouldn't mind if you just go back for 1 second. There's a question that came through about, so you mentioned it, I think it's the third bullet here about satisfying themselves in the integrity of financial information. Michelle asked the question, how do we encourage scrutiny and challenge of financials? P&L is often complex and confusing, and that means that it's not getting a lot of challenge. Is there any guidance on a question that could be framed on this topic?
And Martin, I think that goes directly to the issue of the board skills matrix and who's sitting on the board and what skills, knowledge, experience, and lived experience are they bringing to the work of the board. And we would expect board members to have financial literacy. Maybe not all of them, but we would expect at least 1 or 2 of them to have deep financial literacy. And of course, it's a requirement for membership of an audit committee under the UK system that there should be that the chair of the audit committee or that a member of the audit committee should have proper knowledge of finance and audit matters. So it has been my experience that often the board membership does not have the same level of expertise to challenge the management information which is being put forward in terms of the numbers. And that way problems lie, and sometimes that way disaster lies. And we've seen real cases, for example, Patisserie Valerie, Enron, and so on, where parallel balance sheets are being run and the numbers simply didn't stack up, but people did not challenge what was being provided by management. So that's critical that one has on the board people who understand numbers and who can challenge management on the P&L, the balance sheet, cash flow, and all of those things. Again, I wouldn't expect everybody on the board to have that financial literacy, but at least some of them should have. What else should the non-exec director do? And this is in the code and in the guidance on board effectiveness. Devote time to developing and refreshing their knowledge and skills, upholding high standards of integrity and probity, and supporting the chair in that respect in terms of culture, values, and behaviours. And again, in the poll feedback, that received quite a low mark in terms of do your non-execs add value in this particular area. Yet most of the cases of organisational collapse all around the world have started off in and around these soft areas of culture, values, and behaviours. And if the non-execs on the board and the board as a whole isn't showing leadership on these soft issues, then the rot begins to develop further down inside the organisation. It's also the job of the directors to demand what they want to see in their board pack. So the high quality information that they require to allow them to do their jobs. Again, taking into account the views of shareholders and other stakeholders where appropriate, and there's an increasing focus these days on finding out what other stakeholders want. Exercising their relevant powers and abiding by the organisation's articles, i.e. we expect directors to understand what they can and cannot do, and it's the job of the governance professional or the company secretary to tell the directors what's in the articles, and the job of the legal function to make sure that those directors continue to operate within the articles, because to operate outside of the articles is a complete no-no. And will land that director in court and in difficulty. Exercising their powers in accordance with the organisation's policies and procedures, disclosing direct and indirect interests, and this goes to directors' duties under the Companies Act 2006, and identifying their interests, and it's their responsibility to do so. It's not the job of the chair, it's not the job of the company secretary, it's the job of the director herself or himself to disclose their interests and to manage those interests in terms of recusing themselves from board discussions and not looking at relevant board minutes, which on issues on which they're conflicted. This is interesting, immediately reporting to the chair their own wrongdoing or the wrongdoing or proposed wrongdoing that they become aware of in relation to any employee or director, not entering into any legal or other commitment or contract on behalf of the organisation unless specifically authorised to do so. And there is case law on that where directors have gone beyond their brief and have contractually obligated their organisation without authorisation, and the organisation has had to bear the liability. So we can see these are a mixture of legal obligations, but also of behaviours on the board. Some other things to say that the directors should be able to secure the time and be able to offer the time commitment for serving on the board, and it was intended under the proposed governance reforms that were due to take place in the UK, but which have now been shelved, that there would be real practical guidance on how many other directorships a director could take up over and above the board on which he or she is sitting. Also that, again, that directors are aware of their legal, regulatory and compliance obligations. I would just go back to this slide just for a second. In terms of time commitment, I found that where many directors are vulnerable and are non-performing is not only in relation to the time they commit, but two other attributes as well: their passion for the business, because if they're not passionate, they will not turn up because they don't care, and their ambition for the business. And so whilst this doesn't appear in code quite so much, time, commitment, passion, and ambition are three drivers of whether the director is going to turn up for meetings and actually contribute to meetings. And we don't get enough made of that in code guidance. And then moving on, penultimate slide, taking responsibility for determining remuneration and expenses, but not getting involved themselves in levels of remuneration which would conflict them with taking decisions which are the best thing for the entity. And I've actually seen examples where, for example, some directors have been over-reliant on fee income from positions held on boards and have therefore been supine and compliant with a particular decision because they do not wish to rock the boat, because they do not wish to jeopardize their fee revenue from their position. And then finally, independent and outside interests. So again, directors' own responsibility to ensure they declare and manage their interest, taking an interest in annual evaluation and performance reviews, and making sure that once every 3 or 4 years, depending on the regulatory guidance, that evaluation is conducted by an independent external expert advisor. and also non-executive directors. It's a basic point. Principal should have access to independent professional advice as part of the deal, as part of the package for serving on the board. So those slides, and I believe we made these slides available. These slides is what appears in code and the guidance on board effectiveness on what an non-executive director is expected to do, both in terms of their legal responsibilities and also in terms of their behaviours and their leadership on the board. Yeah.
Sorry, yeah, no, it's excellent. And that we get even, I mean, you get even deeper on the masterclass for this. It's we had a couple of I know we've got a few minutes left. Can we drop into a couple of questions?
Yeah.
There's a really interesting one here from Sally who asks, how can you deal with the views of shareholders when the main ones sit as observers on the board and can dominate the conversation, but you need to maintain a good relationship for potential future investment?
Yeah, so that's a really good question, Sally. And that's not quite a stakeholder board in the sense, or nomination board where the shareholders are nominated as directors onto the board, but that does sometimes happen. That is a very problematic situation, I think. It's a bit like somebody having a conflict of interest as a director on the board and being allowed to stay in the room whilst the issue is being discussed, because whilst they're sitting in the room, they are influencing the discussion. That is a governance challenge, Sally. There's a governance solution to every governance challenge, but that is a very specific governance challenge, and that is not ideal, that people who have influence or providing capital into the business are not sitting on the board, but are effectively influencing the decision-making. And it could get to the point where they become shadow directors, which is that they have that influence and level of power where people are prepared to act according to their wishes rather than the wishes of the board. And shadow directors, as we know, that's bad news for board, and shadow directors should not be allowed to become part of the board model. So that is difficult. Actually, very quickly, how would you determine over-reliance on fees? Well, actually, it's something I said in the previous slide, that it's something of which to be aware. The chair and the company secretary need to be aware of that. And sometimes it's pretty obvious, and I've seen it becoming pretty obvious, that an NED needs those fees and therefore will not rock the boat. But that's a bigger issue for discussion, I think, at the masterclass, and hopefully we can capture some of these questions for the masterclass. We ought to move on, just in terms of the interest of time. Martin, back to you.
Yeah, thanks. We've got a poll here, and actually, as you say, Seamus, a couple of things on the masterclass. There's a great question about, coming through about which we can cover on the masterclass, about what type of experience do you need to get to become a non-exec director, and what does that look like over the next couple of years? So it'd be great to get into that on the masterclass. So thank you very much, everybody, for your engagement and participation and joining us today. If you could take a moment just to rate this masterclass, that would be great. It's on the screen at the moment. And if you'd like to learn more about so this is the only question actually that isn't anonymous. It'd be great to hear from you whether you'd like to learn more about Onboard. We have a really an interesting AI assistant for board members at the moment that's in beta. There was a question earlier on about AI. Unfortunately, we didn't get the chance to get into that. It's its own topic in itself. But if you would like to know more about that, then please get in touch. It's in beta at the moment. And the masterclass is on the 15th of December at 12:30 p.m. GMT. And it'd be amazing for you to join us. We're going to put the link to that into the chat in a moment. You can click on that and join us. Seamus, as always, super insightful. We're coming to the end of this series shortly, so this will be our last sort of deep dive masterclass. And thank you very much, as always, for all your experience as well.
Yeah, no, thank you, Martin. I apologise for issues of audio, but lovely to see everybody, and thank you very much for all the great questions, and we'll capture the ones that we haven't answered, and we'll answer them at the masterclass next month. That'd be great. Thank you.
Thanks very much, everyone.
Yeah, thank you. Bye-bye. Thank you, everyone.